And now, we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
What is this thing? What's this podcast?
Welcome to the musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
I'm Johnson Page.
We just talk to interesting people about interesting stuff.
When Cronkite would go on, and he was called the most trusted man in America, everybody kind of assumed that the data that was given from 6:30 to 7 o'clock every day was a set of facts that we were all then going to have to come to grips with.
Now, that short theme at the top of every hour meant that you were about to get 5 minutes of the latest world and national news from CBS Radio. As of May 22nd, it's gone. CBS News has shut down its radio division after 99 years of broadcasting. That top-of-the-hour news could be heard on 700 stations nationwide. Now, granted, most if not all of those stations were on the AM band, which was probably a big factor in CBS Radio's demise. This is just the latest, but possibly the biggest shift that we've seen in how people get their news, with social media rapidly taking the place of trusted sources of news like CBS. Here to talk with us today about all this is Robert Thompson. He's a trustee professor of television, radio, and film at Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Public Communications. And he's the director of the Bleier Center for Television and Popular Culture. Welcome back to the podcast, Bob.
And thank you for inviting me.
So let's get your initial reaction when you first heard that CBS is shutting down the shop. What is your take?
Well, first of all, I guess I took it personally in that I've done many, many, many interviews with CBS Radio. I'm not on the payroll, but when stories break, oftentimes they'll call. Usually the first time I hear about the death of a major celebrity is I get a call from Arlene at CBS Network Radio talk about this person. So, and by the way, it was interesting. I got on my email digitally through a computer. The very way I heard about this tells us everything we need to know about this crisis. So I hear about the demise of CBS Radio on a news feed that gets pushed digitally to me. And not 10 minutes, I'm not making this up, not 10 minutes after that, I get a call from Arlene at CBS News Radio to talk about the death of Chuck Norris, who used to come in and save a lot of things, but I don't think Walker, Texas Ranger is going to save this mess.
No,
But
I think not.
we should step back and really think about how profound this is. We talk about, it was almost 100 years old. CBS Network News Radio pulled a Betty White. It almost made the century mark, but not quite. But that's a big deal when we think about it in many ways. And even though CBS isn't as old as NBC, CBS, for all intents and purposes in most people's minds, invented broadcast journalism. When we think of the great moments of broadcast journalism before television, we think of them as CBS radio moments. And of course, Edward R. Murrow, who's considered the dean of broadcast journalism. All those broadcasts from the roofs of London during the bombings. This is London. That's kind of the Genesis 1:1 statement of broadcast journalism. In the beginning is, this is London. Murrow, in those incredibly macabre poetry reports as Allied troops marched into Buchenwald and the other camps, that was all CBS Radio. So much of how we experienced the Second World War, it came from those CBS reports. This shutting down is a big deal historically. But what we could say is, I'm just an old guy nostalgically talking about a medium that has been completely, replaced by other things. But that isn't necessarily true either. Yes, radio used to be the big medium that was the dominant medium that everybody consumed. That was replaced by television. But radio didn't go away. It no longer did cop shows and soap operas and game shows and everything else. Television did that. But radio continued. And as a news broadcaster, we could hear it in the car. We'd hear it portably. When the electricity went out, we had battery-powered radios and not television. So radio remained important. And now, as the era of the podcast has come in, the very thing that we are having this conversation on is demonstrating that the medium of audio only is not only a dinosaur, it has been reinvigorated in just a new way. We call them podcasts now, but podcasts and radio are practically synonymous. So CBS News Radio would not have to have gone away. I think it went away not because it was a technological dinosaur. Any podcast will tell you that. It went away from two major shifts that have totally thrown journalism and the very way we live our daily lives into a state of unknown. And that is changes in technology, digital computer technology, and the fragmentation of the audience that came with those changes in technology. And whether our notion of a healthy journalism is going to survive that is a big question. Whether our notion of human existence is going to survive it, I think may be in question as well.
I'm a customer, if you will, of CBS News. I must have heard it tens of thousands of times, no, not just thousands of times. I've tuned into it on purpose. When something has happened, it was dependable. I tended to trust it more than my local news because my local newscasters were a little bit fritzy. But I felt that it was a very professional operation. So my question, Robert, is what do we replace it with if we're going to replace it with anything?
I felt the same way that you did. There was a sense that CBS and what they used to call it, the Tiffany Net. And back when Paley was running it, for a good portion of the early CBS, the news department wasn't making any money. It was kind of the status. The grand old man wanted to be respected by the fancy places that he liked to hang out in. And he had to have something that could compensate for the fact that he was airing Gilligan's Island. And one of the ways that was CBS News was this, it was a prestige sort of thing. I could be wrong about this, but I don't think the news division started making money maybe until the Vietnam era when all of a sudden news became this major part of programming. You took it seriously. I took it seriously. It deserved to be taken seriously. During that period of the radio era and then into the television era in the 50s, what Murrow was doing would See It Now, the Murrow taking on McCarthy, documentaries on migrant workers like Harvest of Shame on CBS Reports, the unbelievable coverage of Vietnam, Morley Safer, that early story from Cam Nee and Charlie Company. This was breathtakingly good, responsible journalism that was doing exactly what journalism is supposed to do in a republic, which is to keep the folks in charge in line, to be antagonistic about people power. We called it the Fourth Estate because it was supposed to keep the other three powerful states in charge. And I think whatever you say about CBS and unfair against the president, and this is what Nixon was saying, and Agnew, who hated CBS, and Johnson as well, not just the Republicans. Lyndon Johnson got his people to do a big investigation on Morley Safer, one of the great people covering the Vietnam War. And they came back and said, sorry, boss, we couldn't find anything. He's Canadian. And apparently Johnson said, knew he wasn't an American. CBS was doing its job. So that rambling, you asked the question of what's going to replace it. You know, I'm afraid that CBS had already been. Those days when CBS was doing that kind of good, old school, dogged journalism like we used to teach in journalism schools and we used to celebrate had already begun to disappear. And we've certainly saw it in the last couple of years with the whole buckling over the 60 Minutes lawsuit, which they could have won legally in any kind of healthy sort of situation. But there were all these other motivations that they wanted to have happen, including that, the merger to take place and all the rest of it. So that CBS of Murrow and Cronkite and Morley Safer and everything had already changed. And I think it began to change with the start of cable. Let's forget streaming for a minute. Let's go back to the
Sure.
early
Ca
80s.
cable was a huge shock, to that model.
Yes, it was. So when you say what's going to replace it, maybe we're 20 years too late for that question because it already has been replaced by itself, what CBS
Sure.
had become. I think I know what you're asking, though, and I don't know the answer to that question. We're about to celebrate 250 years. What was that famous quote that Jefferson probably didn't say, but he's attributed to saying, between having no government and newspapers or having newspapers and no government, I'll take the latter.
Yeah. Right.
Now, that may be a little simplified. I don't know if Jefferson ever actually said that,
By
but
the way, I wish he had said it.
a democratic republic is a dicey thing to keep going. And one of the things you need to keep it going, to keep it lubricated, is good journalism. But there's a really tough problem with that, and that is journalism costs a lot of money. And a lot more now in the age of electronic media and global bureaus and all that kind of stuff than it did back in Jefferson's time. And our media, it was not done by the British system where licenses on actual hardware and stuff like that. It was pretty much, with the exception of PBS and NPR and that kind of thing, was supported by advertising dollars.
Yeah. By the way, if I could just step in and explain to our viewers that in Britain, licenses and hardware to have television and receive television, at least until recently, were issued directly by the government, which is exactly what doesn't happen here. It was always supposed to be private enterprise, so to speak. And as you say, certainly CBS is just as fascinating as a company with a history as it is as a newsmaking or news reporting enterprise. It was independent from the government, which is why people were always investigating them and trying to get them out of there because they would give you bad news.
And that's a good point to make, because now we look at maybe the British system not being subject to having to serve at the whims of mammoth money. But I don't think we wanted a system that was controlled by the government either, even though there was a lot of protections in the British system. We saw this with PBS back when they were still getting federal money. PBS, for as much of the wonderful things that they do, and they have done, and they continue to do many wonderful things, they buckled a lot over the fear of worry. PBS has done some spineless things based on the fear that they were going to lose the funding from the federal government. So that had all of its problems as well. But as much as I don't want to get all sanguine and nostalgic for the days when the grand old man era, where you had these people like Paley who were in control of most of the information that we got, but they did get to make decisions based on their own honorability, their own ego. And Paley fought with CBS News folks like Murrow, whom he kind of fired, like Fred Friendly and all of that. But there was a sense that his individual ego and legacy, CBS News had a place in. With these huge corporate entities now that the news are just one little tiny part in, there's no place for that kind of element. We're essentially making decisions of how to run these places based completely on the math and the algorithm and all of that kind of thing. And that doesn't leave room for those old models. By the way, also, before we get too nostalgic of the Murrow era, one of the very first news shows on American TV was called the Camel News Caravan. Martial music and light up a camel and get tomorrow's news today on the Camel News Caravan. And the anchor had a big camel ashtray with the name on it and everything. Now, imagine today the Marlboro Lights, NBC Evening News. That seems totally outrageous. And it is outrageous. Who were the biggest sponsors of early news? Were tobacco companies, car companies.
Sure, always.
And back when those news were that news was emerging, early 50s into the 60s, what was one of the biggest stories out there? The emerging crisis that we were learning that cigarettes were causing. Murrow actually covered that while he was
Dying
sucking
of,
down
yeah.
4 packs of unfiltered a day. But you can certainly see how there were probably things that weren't being covered or weren't being covered in the same way back then. So it wasn't the perfect system, but it certainly worked a lot better than the one we're seeing today.
Well, the other thing too, and John, you were talking about your local news anchors being a little iffy. Television news on a local level is entertainment as much as it is news. And part of that is because that is the major revenue producer for a local television station, is the local news they produce. So when you get a local television news anchor, they're as concerned about how they look and how they come across as the facts that they report. And the thing that always got me about CBS, and especially in the radio side, was that they hired journalists. They hired people who knew how to put a story together, how to get information from sources, how to confirm that information, and how to put it out to the point where if CBS News said something, they weren't going to have to retract it in 2 or 3 hours or 2 or 3 days. You know that they had already done the footwork and had already figured out that the story was solid before they present it to you. Recently, when that 60 Minutes program on the mega prison down in Central America was thrown out, everybody who had worked on it, from the reporter to the producer to the cameraman, said, "No, we figured this out. We went through and made sure all the facts are correct." And management had some sort of thing about, well, we needed to hear from the administration. And the reporter said, "I asked the administration and they refused to comment on it." When the management went back to the administration, they still refused to comment on it. So eventually they wound up running it. But that was the difference to me between local news and CBS, is that CBS had journalists who knew how to do it. And that's one of the things I'm afraid we're losing as things like CBS and your major newspapers go away and don't come back.
Yeah, I mean, we do have that stereotype of the local anchor, Ted Baxter, the Happy News, and all of that sort of thing. There's a great episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show where Walter Cronkite comes on and meets Ted Baxter, almost like matter and antimatter in the
Yes.
world of truth and the American way and journalism stuff. However, I want to be careful about privileging the legitimacy of national journalists with their standards and local journalism, in that local journalism is also having some serious threats to it as well. And local journalism is, in the end, maybe even more important because it's happening on a daily level. So I guess you've identified there's two potential problems here. One would be the idea that local journalism, because it's an income generating part of the stations, has to be concerned about getting viewers, not necessarily journalistic standards. That's one potential problem. The other problem is the idea that local journalism could simply go away. Now, it tends to be profitable, but there's always a sense that you can have 4 hours of afternoon journalism that your local station has, or they can simply put reruns of The Big Bang Theory and Two and a Half Men during that period. Those alternative business models, I think, are battling it out. Local television is very profitable in some markets. Lots of places where we have local news deserts, like we have food deserts, grocery deserts.
I might add to that point too, that the places where local news is shakiest are the places that tend to be the least served generally by media, as you know better than I do. And I don't want to wax nostalgic either, but at least I can just speculate for a moment. I mean, what do we want? I guess that's a good way to put this. I mean, I can say that what I would like is to know that there's some original reporting going on, that there's a group of people who actually their jobs are to go find out what has happened. And if there are reports from other places, that their job is to confirm reports from other places. So it doesn't all have to be originary, but they have to do the checking. And I'm not worried about AI as long as it doesn't take over everything, because AI is never going to be able to make some of the decisions you have to make when you're reporting things. It's too fast, for example, and also it does require value judgments that AI ain't good at.
You say though, what you want is the question is, okay, so why can't we have that anymore? There are plenty of people out there, smart, well-trained reporters and journalists who can get their second sources, who can confirm, who can write it up, who can announce it, who can do all that.
Sure.
The problem is there's plenty of those people, and they're getting fired from the Washington Post. They're getting fired
Mm.
from the LA Times. They're getting fired from CBS. All these places that are the Washington Post itself didn't report its own apocalypse of firing. Well, I read it in the AP.
There's a long tradition that you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to report your own bad news first in order to
Right,
show
and
how upstanding you are, and that didn't happen.
Yep.
no, didn't. And at the same time, the Today Show was covering their family tragedy every day on top of the hour. So we've got plenty of people who would do this. The problem is, okay, so you're talking of those underserved areas. Here we get back to the beginning of this conversation's radio. Radio is cheap to do. You don't have cameras. You don't have to go out and get pictures. It's cheaper to do just audio. However, all those radio stations, when I moved into this part of the country in upstate New York back in the mid 1980s, there were all these local stations, and a lot of it, let's face it, was quirky. They had an hour long on one station, WMCR, called the Trading Post. Call in, and they had a lawnmower to sell. They'd give their own number, and people could come and pick it up after 4 o'clock, whatever. It was community service, though, and then they would cover the school board and the high school games and all that kind of stuff. None of those stations, well, I shouldn't say none, but most of those stations have been bought up by people at places like iHeartRadio. No Heart Radio is a friend of mine who got fired. Let's called it. And what they do is all of these local call-in shows and local news shows and everything have been replaced by syndicated stuff that goes all over the country, Hannity or whatever, all those syndicated things. AM radio that used to be a bastion of local talk and local school closings and snow coverage and all of that, that used to be a bastion of a local voice, has been replaced by these national syndicated plays, many of which just play automated programs. So that's a place where local could have stayed. So what we're saying is that all of the opportunities for doing this are proving not profitable when compared to other things you could do with your media companies.
Mhm.
And in our economic environment, that means that the most profitable was going to work, especially when these companies are run by our huge companies that have to please stockholders that really need to keep those growth of profit all the time. People will take their money and invest elsewhere. That's why you asked a question of how do we get what we want in our journalism? I don't know, because I understand all the reasons why what we had is being taken away and collapsing. I have no idea how you reverse that trend.
I know that some journalists have taken to putting together websites, for lack of a better word, that can concentrate on news where they can continue to ply their trade. But again, we find this, John and I, we put this podcast together. There are 7 billion podcasts out there. Everybody who has a computer has a podcast. To get yourself noticed is very, very hard, very difficult to stand out
expensive,
from the
too.
crowd.
There's what,
Unless-
7 billion people in the country. There's 14 billion podcasts.
Exactly.
The world,
And unless you're doing all Star Wars all the time or all cartoons all the time or some theme like that that appeals to hundreds of thousands of looky-loos, you're not going to attract the audience you need. And I think that's what some of these websites are saying. Again, how do journalists ply their trade now when they don't have that free and open and always available outlet to go to? That's one of the problems too.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, journalists had the same problem that rock stars had. I mean, it used to be music was distributed by a bunch of big record labels, and then you would hear it on a finite number of radio stations. And what that created were these huge stars, you name it, Sinatra, Elvis, Michael, whoever. And everybody knew those people. They were central to the soul of the nation. You might have hated Elvis's music, but you could not avoid it. It was everywhere. Many were called to become huge stars. Few were chosen, but those tiny numbers became, big, giant stars. That centralization meant one thing in the music industry or the entertainment industry or sports or whatever. The finite number of people, we all knew the home run hitters and the rock stars, whatever. It meant something very different in journalism, but the mechanics were the same, which means that when Walter Cronkite had the absolute hubris to end every broadcast saying, "And that's the way it is," and nobody laughed at it. I mean, that was he said that with complete and total seriousness, but that had a national maintenance function that we are having a really hard time living without, and I don't see how it will ever come back. Which means we agreed there was a couple of a finite number of places, and there was a lot of problems with this. Many people didn't have a voice back when we had 3 networks delivering everything.
And may I just interject? Most of the people we saw on the air were middle-aged males.
Middle-aged males,
middle-aged
middle-aged white males with certain political training and background and all that. I mean, yes, it's true. And the internet has both a blessing and a curse. It gave voice to many people who had no voice, and that's a really good thing. Gave voice to many people I wish still had no voice, but whatever. If that network era I'm waxing eloquent about had really serious issues, and one of them was the monolithic nature. However, let's acknowledge all of that. But when Cronkite would go on, and he was called the most trusted man in America, everybody kind of assumed that the data that was given from 6:30 to 7 o'clock every day was a set of facts that we were all then going to have to come to grips with. That was in the days when somebody, a political leader or a candidate or whatever, did something outrageous. It would be reported, but their career ended. Watergate would be a perfect example of that, where a set of facts ultimately prevailed. And part of that came from the fact that we all agreed on this, partly because of this monolithic set of sources. We all agreed on the fact. So when Walter Cronkite goes on the air of CBS News 1968 and makes that editorial, very unusual, by the way, that says this Vietnam War, it's not working. The best we can do is get out and negotiate an honorable a treaty. And Johnson then said, again, maybe apocryphal, but it was reported to have said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. The facts meant something back then. That whole notion has completely been obliterated. Remember the whole alternative facts thing. Now there is no sense that you can have a debate because nobody agrees on any set of data. The scientific method, which journalism tried to approach, is completely unapplicable now to cultural and political discourse. There are no agreed upon facts. There are people who, if you say, but it was reported in the New York Times, would say, oh, it was the New York Times, therefore it's untrue. You can't use that as an argument. That leads ultimately to rhetorical chaos. And I think we are in that chaos. You shake your head and say that this is madness. None of this makes any sense. The whole system of journalism, just the facts, ma'am, and then we make decisions based on that, is completely collapsed.
That's true. But CBS is coming to the rescue with Whiskey Fridays with Tony DeCouple. So,
And I know I've been waiting for that. So
yeah.
Let's remember, however, that Edward R. Murrow's, the reporter from Buchenwald, This is London, the roofs of London, taking on McCarthy and knocking him down. His most successful, popular, highest rated show he ever did was a thing called Person to Person, where
Yep.
he would do live interviews with Marilyn Monroe and Sophie Tucker and talk about her quilt that her grandmother made. It did some, I think the Kennedys he interviewed as well, but it was basically a fluffy, whatever kind of thing. You got to kind of do that stuff in a
Of course you do.
system like this. And let's also remember, in the end, Friendly, Murrow's producer, and Edward R. Murrow could not sustain what they did in at CBS. And this is not CBS 2026. This is CBS 1960.
Right.
And you know what Murrow went on to do? He started making anti-communist propaganda films for the U.S. information agents. If it's them doing it, it's propaganda. If it's us doing it, it's education.
And Robert, you could talk about this. There's always been an entertainment aspect to the news. For high volume of listeners, it seems there's always been like an aspect of entertainment to help pay the bills to some extent. I guess the question is, to what extent does it overwhelm the presentation?
Oh, I've never liked the distinction between news and entertainment, and especially in this country. I suppose if you look in some countries where someone just goes a single shot and they are reading a bunch of information, that may be a difference, but we've never had that distinction. I would go so far as to say all of news, including really good news, including Murrow's See It Now and the CBS Reports thing, those wonderful things. It's all entertainment. Nobody is being forced to watch it. The best example of this, I think, is 60 Minutes. That show has been on since 1968. Most people alive in this country never lived in an era without 60 Minutes. I think if you did all the math of all the shows ever made in this country, you could probably make a pretty good argument. 60 Minutes is the most popular television show ever made in the United States. Those were good, solid documentaries. By the way, it was a 60 Minutes segment in 1989 that helped make my career. They came to my university and did a piece on the outrageousness of giving college credit for watching the Beverly Hillbillies. And I think they did a really good job of arguing that if you want to understand American history, you need to know its wars and its presidents, but you also need to know its love songs and its sitcoms. This was not goofy news. 60 Minutes was serious stuff, and it was hugely popular. So I don't think we have to compromise the entertainment quality. Look at all the documentaries that do really well. It's just that you've got to do it well, and that's not as easy. Sometimes it's easier to just say which celebrities slept with their sister, their boyfriend's sisters. The answer may surprise you coming up next. I mean,
right.
But that isn't just entertainment. That's just stupidity.
Definitely. And that's rumor, and rumor sometimes is as important to people as actual news.
The importance of journalism and what I see, where it's all going, I think the news is really, really grim. And the sad thing is the news itself may not be there to report it.
Well, we'll see what happens in the future, and whatever it is, at least we'll have the memories of Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite to back us up. Bob Thompson, thanks for being with us today and taking us on this trip.
As always, thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy our conversations.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or log into our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
Our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.